You're standing in a room, and someone tells you the walls are blue, but you see white walls, pristine, clearly white walls. Yet they insist, with unwavering confidence, that you're wrong. They bring in others who nod and agree. Yes, the walls are obviously blue. After days, weeks of this, you begin to doubt your own eyes. This is gaslighting, the systematic erosion of someone's trust in their own perception of reality. Named after the 1944 film Gaslight, where a husband deliberately dims the gaslights in their home while denying any change. This technique is psychological warfare at its most insidious. The gaslighter operates through 3 phases. First, they plant seeds of doubt about small, seemingly insignificant things. Did you really say that? Are you sure that happened? Then, they escalate, challenging bigger memories and perceptions, while maintaining absolute certainty in their version of events. Finally, they recruit others to validate their distorted reality, creating an echo chamber that drowns out the victim's inner voice. What makes gaslighting so devastating isn't just the confusion, it's the isolation. When you can't trust your own mind, you become completely dependent on others to navigate reality. The gaslighter becomes your anchor in a world they've made uncertain, creating a twisted form of psychological dependence. Watch for the warning signs: constant second-guessing of your memory, feeling like you're too sensitive, and that nagging sense that you're going crazy. Because in the hands of a skilled manipulator, your greatest strength, your ability to question and doubt, becomes the very tool used to destroy you. Brainwashing. Brainwashing represents the most extreme form of psychological manipulation, the complete restructuring of an individual's belief system, personality, and worldview. Originally studied in prisoners of war and cult indoctrination, these techniques have been refined and deployed across various contexts. The process requires 3 critical components: isolation, dependency, and systematic breakdown of existing identity. Isolation removes external reality checks and competing influences. The victim becomes entirely dependent on their captors or manipulators for information about the world. This dependency extends to basic needs: food, shelter, social contact, and emotional support. The breakdown phase involves destroying the victim's existing sense of self through sleep deprivation, nutritional stress, sensory manipulation, and constant psychological pressure. The mind becomes malleable when pushed beyond its capacity to maintain normal cognitive function. Confusion and disorientation create vulnerability to new programming. Reconstruction follows destruction. New beliefs, values, and identity components are introduced when the victim is most psychologically vulnerable. These aren't presented as opinions, but as fundamental truths. The new worldview is reinforced through repetition, emotional manipulation, and social pressure from other indoctrinated individuals. The technique succeeds because it exploits fundamental human needs for belonging, meaning, and psychological safety. When these needs are threatened and then conditionally restored based on acceptance of new beliefs, the mind adapts to preserve survival and social connection. Modern applications appear in corporate training, political movements, and relationship dynamics. The complete isolation of historical brainwashing is replaced by information bubbles, echo chambers, and systematic discrediting of outside perspectives. Bait and switch. Imagine walking into a store, drawn by an incredible deal advertised in the window. You're excited, wallet ready, only to discover that the advertised item is, unfortunately, sold out. But the salesperson has something even better, at twice the price. You've just experienced the bait and switch, one of the most fundamental tricks in the dark psychology playbook. But this technique extends far beyond retail. In relationships, someone might present themselves as your ideal partner, sharing your values, dreams, and interests. They shower you with attention, making you feel understood and cherished. Once you're emotionally invested, once you've fallen for the bait, the switch occurs. Gradually, their true personality emerges. The caring listener becomes controlling. The supportive partner becomes demanding. The person who shared your dreams now dismisses them. The psychological power of bait and switch lies in the commitment principle. Once we've made a decision, once we've invested time, emotion, or resources, our minds work overtime to justify that investment. We tell ourselves that the original person is still there, just hidden. We make excuses. We rationalize. We stay. Politicians master this technique. They campaign on promises of change, transparency, and serving the people, the bait that hooks voters. Once in office, the switch reveals business as usual, broken promises, and serving special interests. Yet voters often remain loyal, trapped by their initial investment of hope and identity. The most insidious aspect of bait and switch is how it exploits our natural optimism and trust. We want to believe in the bait because it represents what we desire most. The manipulator doesn't create false hope. They identify your existing hopes and mirror them back to you, making the bait irresistibly personal. Recognizing bait and switch requires constant vigilance for inconsistencies between promises and actions, between the initial presentation and ongoing behavior. Trust, but verify. Always verify. Blame shifting. It's not my fault. It's yours. These 5 words represent one of the most psychologically devastating weapons in the manipulator's arsenal: blame shifting. Unlike simple denial or making excuses, blame shifting is a sophisticated redistribution of responsibility that leaves victims questioning their own reality. Watch how it unfolds. When confronted about failures or mistakes, instead of accepting responsibility, the blame shifter immediately pivots. They point to external factors, other people's actions, or circumstances beyond their control, as the real cause of the problem. Notice the psychological mechanics at work. First, the blame shifter deflects responsibility away from themselves. Second, they redirect it towards specific targets, usually people who are vulnerable, absent, or unable to defend themselves. Third, they create a narrative where they're actually the victim of others' incompetence or malice. In toxic relationships, blame shifting becomes even more sinister. When confronted about hurtful behavior, the manipulator transforms the conversation. "I only yelled because you made me angry. If you weren't so sensitive, we wouldn't have this problem. You're the one who's always starting fights." The victim finds themselves defending their own reactions instead of addressing the original issue. The psychological damage runs deep because blame shifting attacks the victim's sense of reality and self-worth. Over time, victims begin to internalize the shifted blame, wondering if they really are the problem. This creates a cycle where the victim becomes hypervigilant about their own behavior, while the manipulator's actions remain unexamined. Effective blame shifting often contains a grain of truth. Perhaps the report was slightly late. Perhaps you were feeling sensitive. This partial truth makes the entire narrative feel plausible, even when it's fundamentally distorted. The manipulator becomes skilled at identifying these small vulnerabilities and magnifying them into major causations. The antidote to blame shifting is maintaining clear boundaries around responsibility. Each person owns their actions, regardless of circumstances or others' behavior. When someone consistently redirects blame, recognize it as a red flag indicating deeper character issues. Divide and conquer. Divide and conquer tactics systematically fragment potential opposition by creating internal conflicts, competing interests, and mutual distrust among group members. Rather than facing a unified force, the manipulator deals with isolated individuals who view each other as threats rather than allies. The technique begins with careful observation of existing tensions, differences, and potential fault lines within the target group. Every group contains natural divisions, personality conflicts, ideological differences, resource competition, or status hierarchies. The manipulator identifies and exploits these existing vulnerabilities rather than creating artificial ones. Information warfare forms the primary weapon. Selective sharing of information creates asymmetric knowledge among group members. Some individuals receive privileged information that others don't, creating insider-outsider dynamics. Rumors, half-truths, and strategic omissions fuel suspicion and paranoia between potential allies. The creation of competing interests prevents unified action. When group members are focused on internal competition rather than external threats, they become unable to coordinate effective responses. Resources are wasted on internal conflicts rather than addressing the actual manipulation. Trust destruction accelerates the process. Once group members begin doubting each other's motives, loyalty, and reliability, cooperation becomes impossible. Each person assumes others are acting in bad faith, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy of betrayal and abandonment. The manipulator maintains a position above the conflict, presenting themselves as a neutral mediator or wise advisor. They offer individual group members special deals, exclusive access, or protected status in exchange for information about others or abandonment of group solidarity. Success is measured by the transformation of a unified group into isolated individuals who view each other as competitors or enemies rather than potential allies against the actual threat. Framing and reframing. The same glass of water can be half empty or half full. The same medical procedure can be described as having a 90% success rate or a 10% failure rate. The same budget cut can be fiscal responsibility or gutting essential services. This is the power of framing, the ability to control perception by controlling context. Framing isn't just about word choice or spin. It's about establishing the entire conceptual framework through which information is interpreted. Master manipulators understand that whoever controls the frame controls the outcome of the conversation, the negotiation, the relationship. Consider how toxic individuals frame conflicts in relationships. When confronted about their hurtful behavior, they don't defend the behavior, they reframe the entire situation. This isn't about what I did, they say. This is about your inability to let things go. They've shifted the frame from their actions to your reactions, from their responsibility to your character flaws. Political manipulation relies heavily on framing. The same policy can be presented as protecting freedom or government overreach, as ensuring security or violating privacy. The facts remain identical, but the frame determines public perception and support. Reframing is framing's more aggressive cousin. While framing establishes initial context, reframing forcibly shifts the context mid-conversation when the current frame isn't serving the manipulator's purposes. It's psychological sleight of hand, redirecting attention away from uncomfortable truths toward more favorable interpretations. The power of framing lies in its invisibility. Most people focus on the content of a message while remaining oblivious to the frame that shapes their interpretation of that content. The manipulator controls the lens through which you see reality. And most victims never realize they're looking through someone else's lens. Effective framing often incorporates emotional triggers. Abstract concepts become personal threats. Complex issues become simple choices between good and evil. Nuanced situations become black and white moral imperatives. The frame doesn't just organize information, it generates specific emotional responses that override rational analysis. Emotional contagion. Have you ever walked into a room and immediately felt the tension, even before anyone spoke? Or found yourself laughing at a comedy show that wasn't particularly funny, simply because everyone else was laughing? You've experienced emotional contagion, the automatic, unconscious mimicking of others' emotional states. This isn't merely empathy or sympathy. Emotional contagion operates below the threshold of awareness, causing us to literally catch emotions like we catch viruses. Our mirror neurons fire in response to others' emotional expressions, triggering similar neurochemical responses in our own brains. Skilled manipulators weaponize this natural phenomenon. They understand that emotions are more contagious than logic, more powerful than facts. A charismatic leader can sweep through a crowd, spreading enthusiasm, anger, or fear like wildfire. Their emotional intensity becomes the crowd's emotional intensity, often overwhelming individual judgment. Consider how toxic individuals use emotional contagion in personal relationships. They arrive home in a rage, filling the space with their anger. Soon, everyone in the household feels agitated, walking on eggshells, absorbing the emotional poison. The manipulator doesn't need to explain their behavior or take responsibility. They've successfully contaminated the emotional environment, making everyone else share in their dysfunction. Social media amplifies emotional contagion exponentially. Outrage spreads faster than information. Fear propagates quicker than facts. Algorithms specifically designed to trigger emotional responses create echo chambers, where specific emotions reverberate and intensify. Users find themselves swept up in collective emotional states: anger, fear, euphoria, often about topics they barely understand. The most dangerous aspect of emotional contagion is how it bypasses critical thinking. When we're in the grip of strong emotions, especially emotions we've caught from others, our prefrontal cortex, responsible for reasoning and judgment, becomes suppressed. We make decisions based on feelings that aren't even originally ours. Anchoring. The first piece of information you receive about any topic becomes an anchor, a reference point that influences all subsequent judgments, often unconsciously and irrationally. This cognitive bias, known as anchoring, represents one of the most powerful tools for manipulating decision-making. The psychological mechanism is deceptively simple. Once an anchor is set, your mind makes adjustments from that initial reference point rather than making independent evaluations. Even when the anchor is completely irrelevant or obviously manipulated, it continues to exert influence over your thinking. Skilled negotiators exploit anchoring ruthlessly. They make the first offer, setting an extreme anchor that shifts the entire negotiation range in their favor. Even when you recognize the initial offer as unreasonable, your counteroffers remain influenced by that original anchor. You think you're being rational, but you're actually dancing to their psychological tune. Manipulative individuals use anchoring to shape perceptions of themselves and others. They introduce themselves with impressive credentials, achievements, or connections, establishing a positive anchor that influences how all their subsequent behavior is interpreted. Later, mistakes or character flaws seem like aberrations rather than revelations of their true nature. The reverse anchoring technique is equally powerful. Instead of establishing a positive anchor for themselves, manipulators establish negative anchors for their targets or competitors. They introduce someone with subtle criticisms, damaging rumors, or unfavorable comparisons. Every interaction afterward is filtered through that negative anchor, creating confirmation bias that reinforces the initial negative impression. Price anchoring extends beyond simple retail tactics. Service providers anchor expectations about time, effort, and quality. This usually takes weeks to complete, makes a few days seem remarkably fast. Most people find this extremely difficult, makes moderate success feel like exceptional achievement. The anchor shapes not just your evaluation of the outcome, but your gratitude and satisfaction with the provider. Social media and news outlets use anchoring to influence public opinion. The first story you read about an event becomes your anchor for understanding subsequent coverage. The initial framing, whether someone is presented as a hero or villain, victim or perpetrator, influences how you interpret every new piece of information about them. The insidious nature of anchoring lies in its persistence. Even when you become aware that an anchor was manipulated or false, it continues to influence your thinking. Knowledge alone isn't sufficient protection. You need active counter-anchoring strategies. Love bombing. Imagine meeting someone who seems perfect. They shower you with attention, affection, and adoration beyond anything you've ever experienced. They text you constantly, bring you gifts, tell you you're their soulmate within days of meeting. They make you feel like the most important person in the world. This isn't love, it's love bombing, one of the most effective manipulation tactics for creating psychological dependency. Love bombing operates on the principle of intermittent reinforcement, one of the most powerful conditioning mechanisms known to psychology. The manipulator provides an overwhelming flood of positive attention and affection, creating an intense emotional high. Your brain releases dopamine, oxytocin, and other neurochemicals associated with bonding and addiction. The key to love bombing's effectiveness is its intensity and speed. Normal relationships develop gradually, with natural ebbs and flows of attention and affection. Love bombing compresses what should be months or years of relationship development into days or weeks. The target becomes addicted to the intense positive feelings and desperately wants to maintain them. But love bombing is always temporary. Once the manipulator feels confident in their control, once the target is emotionally hooked, the love bombing gradually decreases. The constant texts become sporadic. The daily gifts disappear. The overwhelming attention turns to calculated neglect. The target finds themselves desperately trying to regain that initial intensity, often compromising their values, boundaries, and self-respect in the process. The psychological damage extends beyond the immediate relationship. Love bombing creates unrealistic expectations for future relationships. Normal, healthy expressions of love and affection seem inadequate compared to the artificial intensity of the love bombing phase. Victims often struggle to recognize genuine, sustainable love because they've been conditioned to expect overwhelming intensity. Love bombing isn't limited to romantic relationships. Manipulative friends, family members, employers, and even organizations use similar tactics. They provide excessive praise, special treatment, or exclusive access to create emotional dependency. Once the target is hooked, the special treatment becomes conditional on compliance and loyalty. The technique is particularly effective on individuals with low self-esteem, previous trauma, or strong needs for validation. The love bomber identifies these vulnerabilities and provides exactly what the target craves most. They become the answer to the target's deepest emotional needs, until they're not. Recognition requires understanding that genuine love develops gradually and sustainably. Healthy relationships have natural rhythms and boundaries. Foot in the door. A small request, seemingly harmless, easy to agree to. You say yes without much thought, perhaps even feeling good about being helpful. What you don't realize is that you've just been caught in one of psychology's most reliable compliance traps, the foot in the door technique. The psychological principle underlying this technique is commitment and consistency. Once you've agreed to a small request, once you've taken a small action that aligns with a particular identity or cause, your mind works to maintain consistency with that initial commitment. You become psychologically invested in being the kind of person who says yes to this type of request. The manipulator starts small because small requests feel safe, reasonable, and low risk. Refusing seems unnecessarily harsh or selfish. Most people agree without recognizing they're being positioned for larger requests down the road. Each yes makes the next yes easier to obtain. The technique escalates gradually and systematically. The second request is slightly larger than the first, but still reasonable compared to what you've already agreed to. The third request builds on the previous two. Before you realize what's happening, you're agreeing to commitments you never would have initially accepted, simply because they arrived at the end of a carefully constructed sequence. Manipulative individuals use foot in the door to reshape relationships and extract resources. They begin with small favors that seem insignificant, borrowing small amounts of money, asking for minor accommodations, requesting simple assistance. Each agreement establishes precedent and creates expectation for future compliance. Organizations and institutions master this technique for recruiting volunteers, donors, and supporters. They don't immediately ask for major commitments. Instead, they start with petition signatures, newsletter subscriptions, or small donations. Once you've identified yourself as a supporter, larger requests feel like natural extensions of your established identity. The power of foot in the door lies in its impact on self-perception. You don't just perform the requested actions. You begin to see yourself as the kind of person who performs such actions. This identity shift makes future compliance seem natural and consistent rather than manipulated. Digital platforms use foot in the door constantly. They start by requesting minimal information or permissions, then gradually expand their access to your data, attention, and behavioral patterns. Each permission granted makes subsequent requests seem reasonable and expected. The technique is particularly effective because it exploits positive social values, helpfulness, consistency, and reliability. Refusing escalating requests feels like betraying your own character rather than resisting manipulation. Door in the face. Someone approaches you with an enormous, unreasonable request that you immediately refuse. Then, moments later, they present a much smaller, more reasonable request. Suddenly, the second request seems not just acceptable, but almost generous compared to the first. You find yourself saying yes, not realizing you've been manipulated by the door in the face technique. This strategy works by exploiting the psychological principle of reciprocal concessions. When someone makes what appears to be a concession, reducing their request from something enormous to something manageable, you feel psychologically obligated to reciprocate with a concession of your own. Your concession is agreeing to their second request. The contrast effect amplifies the technique's power. The same request that might seem unreasonable in isolation appears moderate and fair when compared to the initial extreme request. Your judgment becomes anchored to the first request, making the second seem like a compromise rather than manipulation. Effective door in the face requires the initial request to be extreme enough to virtually guarantee refusal, but not so absurd that it seems like a joke or insincere attempt. The manipulator needs you to take the first request seriously, to actually consider and reject it, for the psychological mechanism to engage properly. The timing between requests is crucial. The second request must follow quickly enough that the contrast effect remains fresh in your mind, but not so quickly that the sequence feels obviously manipulative. Skilled practitioners wait just long enough for you to feel the weight of having said no before presenting the alternative. Charitable organizations frequently employ this technique. They might initially ask for a substantial monthly commitment that most people refuse, then immediately suggest a much smaller one-time donation. The smaller donation seems reasonable by comparison, and your psychological need to reciprocate their apparent concession makes agreement feel almost obligatory. In personal relationships, manipulative individuals use door in the face to extract compliance while making targets feel like they're being reasonable. They make outrageous demands, then scale back to what they actually wanted all along. The target feels relieved to avoid the extreme request and grateful for the apparent compromise. Sales professionals master this technique by presenting premium packages first, knowing most customers will refuse, then offering standard packages that seem affordable by comparison. The customer feels like they're getting a deal and making a smart financial decision, not realizing their judgment has been systematically manipulated. The technique is particularly insidious because it makes you feel like you're maintaining control and making independent decisions. You refuse the first request, after all. You negotiated. You reached a compromise. The sense of agency masks the reality of manipulation. Subliminal messaging. Subliminal messaging operates below the threshold of conscious awareness, implanting ideas, emotions, and behavioral impulses directly into the unconscious mind. While dramatic portrayals in media often exaggerate its power, the technique remains a subtle but effective tool for psychological influence. The methodology relies on presenting information too quickly, quietly, or peripherally for conscious recognition, while remaining strong enough to register unconsciously. This might involve brief image flashes, embedded audio frequencies, or environmental cues that create emotional states without obvious sources. Repetition amplifies subliminal effectiveness. Single exposures have minimal impact, but repeated unconscious exposure to the same messages creates cumulative psychological effects. The unconscious mind begins recognizing patterns and developing preferences without the conscious mind understanding why. Emotional conditioning forms a critical component. Subliminal messages work most effectively when paired with emotional states. Positive emotions associated with products, ideas, or people create unconscious preferences. Negative emotions linked to competitors or alternative choices create unconscious aversion. The technique succeeds because consciousness acts as a filter and critic of incoming information. When messages bypass conscious evaluation, they avoid rational analysis that might reject or modify their influence. The unconscious mind accepts information more readily than the critical conscious mind. Modern applications extend far beyond advertising. Social media algorithms create subliminal influence through content timing, emotional pairing, and frequency manipulation. Political messaging uses background music, color schemes, and image associations to create unconscious emotional responses that influence voting behavior. Fear appeals and scare tactics. Fear is the most primitive and powerful of human emotions. It bypasses rational thought, triggers immediate physiological responses, and motivates instant action. Master manipulators understand that a frightened mind is a compliant mind, and they weaponize fear with surgical precision. Fear appeals operate by presenting a threat, real or imagined, then positioning the manipulator as the solution to that threat. The formula is elegantly simple. Create anxiety, then provide relief. Generate fear, then offer protection. The target becomes psychologically dependent on the manipulator for safety and security. The most effective fear appeals combine three elements. The threat must feel personal and immediate. The consequences must seem severe and unavoidable. And the proposed solution must appear to be the only viable option. When these elements align, critical thinking shuts down and compliance becomes almost automatic. Manipulative individuals use fear appeals to control relationships and extract compliance. They paint pictures of dire consequences if their demands aren't met, if their advice isn't followed, if their version of reality isn't accepted. They become the sole source of protection from the very threats they've constructed. The technique extends beyond personal manipulation into broader social control. Political movements use fear, appeals to rally support, and justify extreme measures. They identify or create existential threats, then position themselves as the only effective defense. Citizens trade freedom for the promise of security, often discovering too late that the threat was exaggerated and the cure worse than the disease. Media organizations exploit fear, appeals for engagement and influence. They amplify dangers, catastrophize problems, and present worst-case scenarios as probable outcomes. Audiences become addicted to the anxiety-inducing content, compulsively consuming news that makes them feel informed but actually leaves them more fearful and less capable of rational analysis. The psychological damage of chronic fear manipulation extends beyond immediate compliance. Constant exposure to fear appeals creates learned helplessness, chronic anxiety, and increased susceptibility to future manipulation. Victims lose confidence in their own judgment and become dependent on external authorities to interpret threats and provide solutions. Fear appeals are particularly effective during times of uncertainty, crisis, or transition. When people feel vulnerable and unsure, they become more susceptible to those who claim to have answers and solutions. The manipulator positions themselves as knowledgeable, confident, and protective during times when targets feel ignorant, confused, and exposed. The technique often incorporates time, pressure, and urgency. The threat is not just severe, it's immediate. Action must be taken now, before it's too late. This urgency prevents careful consideration and research, forcing decisions based on emotion rather than analysis. Grooming. Grooming is the systematic process of preparing someone for exploitation by gradually breaking down their boundaries, normalizing inappropriate behavior, and creating psychological dependency. Unlike other manipulation techniques that seek immediate compliance, grooming is a patient, methodical campaign designed to fundamentally alter the target's perception of normal and acceptable behavior. The process begins with careful target selection. Groomers identify individuals who appear vulnerable, those who are isolated, have low self-esteem, come from troubled backgrounds, or have significant emotional needs. They present themselves as understanding, supportive, and uniquely capable of meeting the target's deepest needs. The initial phase focuses on building trust and establishing special relationships. The groomer provides exceptional attention, understanding, and validation. They create a sense of uniqueness, telling the target they're special, different, more mature than others their age. This special status becomes a source of identity and self-worth that the target desperately wants to maintain. Boundary erosion happens gradually and systematically. The groomer introduces progressively inappropriate behavior through a process called normalization. They start with minor boundary violations that seem innocent or accidental, then gradually escalate. Each violation that goes unchallenged becomes the new baseline for acceptable behavior. Isolation is a crucial component of grooming. The groomer works to separate the target from friends, family, and other support systems that might recognize the manipulation or provide alternative perspectives. They create an us versus them mentality, positioning themselves as the only person who truly understands or cares about the target. The groomer creates a climate of secrecy around their relationship. They explain that others wouldn't understand their special connection, that society isn't ready for their type of relationship, that disclosure would hurt both parties. This secrecy becomes a form of complicity that makes the target feel responsible for maintaining the manipulation. Emotional manipulation intensifies throughout the grooming process. The groomer alternates between excessive praise and subtle punishment, creating an unpredictable emotional environment that keeps the target constantly seeking approval and validation. The target learns to anticipate and cater to the groomer's emotional needs. Grooming often involves the gradual introduction of inappropriate sexual content or behavior. This process is so gradual and mixed with positive attention that targets often don't recognize the inappropriate nature until much later. The groomer normalizes each step, making the progression seem natural and consensual. The long-term psychological effects of grooming extend far beyond the immediate relationship. Victims often struggle with feelings of responsibility and guilt, questioning their own perceptions and judgment. They may have difficulty establishing healthy boundaries in future relationships and remain vulnerable to subsequent manipulation. Plausible deniability. You're in a meeting, and your colleague makes a comment that sounds like they're undermining your project. When you confront them later, they respond with wide eyes. "Oh my goodness, you completely misunderstood. I was actually trying to help you by pointing out potential issues before the client does." This is plausible deniability. This tactic works like a poisoned gift wrapped in beautiful paper. The manipulator delivers their harmful message in a way that allows them to claim good intentions if challenged. They're masters of the ambiguous statement, the backhanded compliment, the helpful criticism. Think about the friend who says, "I love how confident you are. I could never wear something so bold." On the surface, it's a compliment. Beneath, they've just called your outfit questionable while positioning themselves as humble and you as potentially reckless. The genius of plausible deniability lies in its emotional impact versus its logical defense. Your gut tells you something's wrong, but your rational mind struggles to articulate why. The manipulator knows this. They're counting on that internal conflict to keep you silent. Politicians are masters of this technique. I'm not saying my opponent is corrupt, but the voters deserve to know about these concerning financial patterns. They've just planted corruption in your mind while maintaining they never made such an accusation. In relationships, it might sound like, "I'm just worried about you because you've been making some interesting choices lately." The word interesting does all the heavy lifting. It's simultaneously supportive and condemning. The defense? Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably island. Don't let someone gaslight you into believing your emotional intelligence is wrong. When you sense plausible deniability at work, call it out directly. Help me understand what you mean by that. Or, can you be more specific? Watch how quickly they backpedal or reveal their true intentions. Remember, genuine communication is clear communication. If someone consistently leaves you feeling confused or attacked while claiming innocence, that's not coincidence. That's strategy. Learned helplessness. In the 1960s, psychologist Martin Seligman conducted an experiment that would change our understanding of human psychology forever. He placed dogs in cages and administered mild electric shocks. The dogs could escape by jumping over a low barrier. Simple enough. But then came the twist. Seligman put some dogs in cages where escape was impossible, no matter what they did. After repeated failed attempts, these dogs stopped trying. Here's the chilling part. When these same dogs were later placed in cages where escape was easy, they didn't even try. They had learned to be helpless. Now, replace those dogs with humans, and the electric shocks with criticism, rejection, failure, or abuse. You've just discovered how learned helplessness becomes a weapon of psychological control. This tactic doesn't require conscious evil intent, though it certainly can involve it. Sometimes, well-meaning parents, teachers, or partners accidentally create learned helplessness by consistently sending the message that the person's efforts are futile, inadequate, or unwelcome. Picture the child whose creative attempts are constantly criticized. That's not how you draw a tree, or, let me do it properly. Eventually, that child stops creating, believing they lack talent. The truth? They never lacked talent. They lacked encouragement. In toxic relationships, learned helplessness is cultivated through a cycle of hope and disappointment. The victim tries to improve the relationship through better communication, changed behavior, or increased effort. But no matter what they do, the problems persist, because the problems aren't actually about their behavior, they're about control. Workplace learned helplessness develops when employees repeatedly see their ideas dismissed, their initiatives blocked, or their efforts undermined. Eventually, they become passive, waiting for direction, afraid to innovate. The organization loses their potential, and they lose their confidence. The insidious nature of learned helplessness is that victims often don't recognize they're trapped by invisible barriers. They've internalized the cage. They'll say things like, "I'm just not good at relationships," or "I don't have leadership qualities," or "I'm not creative." Breaking learned helplessness requires what psychologists call mastery experiences. Small wins that prove your actions can create positive outcomes. Start with low-stakes situations where success is likely. Build evidence against the voice in your head saying, "Nothing you do matters." Remember, learned helplessness is a condition, not a character trait. It's something that happened to you, not something that is you. The cage door is open now. You just have to remember how to walk through it. Lowballing. Lowballing exploits the psychological commitment principle by securing agreement to attractive terms that are subsequently revealed to be unavailable, while alternative, less favorable options remain accessible. The technique transforms initial attraction into final acceptance of inferior deals through psychological entrapment. The initial offer must be genuinely compelling to generate real interest and mental commitment. This isn't about deception regarding the basic product or service, but about creating artificially attractive terms that won't actually be available. The goal is psychological investment in the general concept. The revelation of unavailability occurs after commitment has been secured, but before completion. The original terms become impossible due to factors supposedly beyond anyone's control. Financing fell through, inventory was miscounted, regulations changed, or similar external circumstances prevent fulfillment of the original agreement. Alternative options conveniently remain available at terms less favorable to the victim, but still acceptable enough to prevent complete withdrawal. These alternatives were likely the intended outcome from the beginning, but their acceptability is enhanced by the contrast with the superior original offer. The psychology succeeds through multiple cognitive traps. Having already committed mentally, backing out feels like admitting error or wasting invested time and energy. The alternative options seem reasonable compared to losing the opportunity entirely. Social pressure from having announced intentions creates additional momentum toward completion. Professional lowballing occurs systematically across industries. Real estate, automotive sales, contracting, and service industries regularly use this technique. The pattern involves initial estimates or quotes that are surprisingly attractive, followed by discovered complications that require additional costs or reduced services, creating a sense of scarcity. Scarcity manipulation artificially inflates demand and reduces decision-making time by claiming that opportunities, resources, or options are limited in quantity or availability. The technique exploits the psychological principle that rare things seem more valuable than abundant alternatives. Artificial limitations create false scarcity through claims about limited quantities, restricted access, or exclusive availability that may not reflect actual supply constraints. The scarcity exists primarily in marketing rather than reality. Time pressure scarcity uses deadlines, expiration dates, or limited time offers to create urgency that prevents careful evaluation. The fear of losing opportunities drives rapid decisions that might not serve the victim's interests. Exclusive access promises make ordinary options seem special through claims of restricted availability to select groups. The exclusivity creates artificial value that exceeds the intrinsic worth of what's being offered. Social proof scarcity suggests that high demand from others is reducing availability for new participants. The popularity becomes evidence of value while creating urgency to secure access before opportunities disappear. That's partless. If you are K, that Telgend able, CU24, that using L, and Levin dies, that using B. Geographic limitations claim that certain benefits or opportunities are only available in specific locations or markets. The restricted access creates value perception that wouldn't exist if the same options were universally available. Inventory manipulation involves strategic control of actual supply to create legitimate scarcity that supports inflated pricing or increased demand. The scarcity becomes real, but artificially manufactured. FOMO amplification combines scarcity with fear of missing out to create powerful emotional pressure for immediate action. The combination of limited availability and social comparison drives irrational decision-making. Stockholm Syndrome. Stockholm Syndrome describes the psychological phenomenon where victims develop positive feelings, empathy, or even romantic attachment toward their abusers or captors. This counterintuitive response occurs through specific psychological conditions that transform survival mechanisms into emotional bonds. The development requires several critical elements. The victim must be isolated from alternative perspectives, completely dependent on the captor for survival needs, and convinced that escape is impossible. Under these conditions, small kindnesses from the captor become disproportionately significant. The psychological mechanism operates through trauma bonding, where shared intense experiences create emotional connections regardless of their negative nature. The victim's survival depends on reading and pleasing the captor, creating intense focus on the captor's needs and emotions. Cognitive dissonance drives the emotional attachment. When escape seems impossible, accepting the situation requires finding ways to make it psychologically tolerable. Viewing the captor as protector rather than threat reduces mental distress, even when the protection is from dangers the captor created. The survival adaptation makes biological sense in hopeless situations. If resistance is impossible and cooperation increases survival chances, the mind adapts by reducing hostility and increasing alliance-building behaviors. The emotions follow the behavioral necessities. Modern applications extend beyond traditional captivity to workplace abuse, domestic violence, and organizational control. Any situation involving isolation, dependency, and intermittent reinforcement can create Stockholm Syndrome-like emotional bonds between victims and abusers. Understanding that positive feelings toward harmful people don't necessarily indicate that the harm was justified or that the person is actually good. These feelings might represent psychological adaptations to inescapable situations rather than accurate assessments of character. Triangulation. Triangulation involves introducing third parties into two-person conflicts to manipulate outcomes, avoid direct confrontation, or maintain control through manufactured drama. The manipulator uses other people as weapons, messengers, or validation sources while avoiding personal accountability. The process typically involves sharing selective information with third parties to gain their support against the primary target. These allies receive biased versions of events that make the manipulator appear reasonable while portraying the target as problematic or unreasonable. Information warfare forms the core strategy. Different people receive different versions of the same events, creating confusion and preventing the formation of accurate understanding about what actually occurred. The manipulator controls the narrative by controlling information flow. Emotional manipulation accompanies triangulation through appeals to loyalty, requests for support, or claims of victimization. The third parties feel obligated to choose sides and often end up fighting battles that aren't actually their own, while the manipulator remains above the conflict. The technique serves multiple purposes: avoiding direct confrontation while still attacking targets, creating social pressure through manufactured consensus, and maintaining plausible deniability by having others deliver harmful messages. Workplace environments frequently feature triangulation through gossip networks, selective reporting to supervisors, or using team dynamics to isolate specific individuals. The manipulator appears cooperative while orchestrating conflicts between others. Awareness of situations where conflicts consistently involve multiple people when they began as simple two-person disagreements. Direct communication between the actual involved parties often resolves issues that seem complicated when filtered through intermediaries. Exploiting empathy. Empathy, exploitation, transforms natural human compassion into a weapon against the empathetic person. Manipulators deliberately trigger sympathy, guilt, and protective instincts to gain compliance, resources, or emotional energy while providing nothing genuine in return. The emotional manipulation often begins with sharing stories of victimization, hardship, or special needs that require assistance. These stories are carefully crafted to trigger specific emotional responses in targets known to be highly empathetic or helpful. Guilt amplification occurs through suggestions that refusing help would be cruel, selfish, or harmful. The empathetic person's natural desire to avoid causing pain gets weaponized against them. Their compassion becomes the source of their exploitation. The victim identity is maintained through constant stories of new problems, ongoing struggles, or special circumstances that require continued assistance. Just when the empathetic person might naturally reduce their helping behavior, new crises emerge that demand renewed support. Reciprocity avoidance ensures that the manipulator never provides equivalent support in return. When the helper experiences problems, the manipulator is unavailable, dismissive, or creates additional demands that prevent mutual support. The relationship remains permanently one-sided. Emotional vampirism drains the helper's psychological resources through constant crisis management, emotional labor, and problem-solving for issues that never actually get resolved. The helper becomes exhausted while the manipulator gains energy from the attention. Understanding that healthy relationships involve mutual support and reciprocity. When someone consistently needs help but never provides it, or when their problems never improve despite extensive assistance, exploitation might be occurring rather than genuine need. Scapegoating. Scapegoating involves systematically blaming one person or group for problems actually caused by multiple factors or different individuals entirely. The technique serves to protect the actual responsible parties while providing a convenient target for anger and corrective action. The selection process typically chooses victims who are different from the majority group, in some visible way, have less power to defend themselves, or have made previous mistakes that can be referenced as evidence of their problematic nature. Blame concentration channels all negative outcomes toward the designated scapegoat, regardless of their actual involvement. When problems occur, the scapegoat's responsibility is assumed rather than investigated. They become the default explanation for anything that goes wrong. Historical revision supports scapegoating by reinterpreting past events to emphasize the scapegoat's role while minimizing other factors. Previous incidents are reframed to suggest patterns of problematic behavior that explain current difficulties. Group dynamics amplify scapegoating through collective agreement that problems would disappear if the scapegoat were removed. This shared belief creates pressure for exclusion or punishment, while avoiding examination of systemic issues or other contributors. The psychological function serves multiple purposes: reducing collective guilt by externalizing responsibility, creating group unity through shared enemy identification, and avoiding difficult changes by focusing on removing individuals rather than fixing systems. Organizational scapegoating often targets employees during times of poor performance, budget cuts, or leadership failures. Rather than examining systemic problems or leadership decisions, individual employees are blamed for broader organizational difficulties. Recognition requires suspicion when blame for complex problems consistently focuses on single individuals, especially when those individuals lack power to create the problems they're blamed for causing. The seed of self-doubt. Planting seeds of self-doubt involves systematically undermining someone's confidence in their own judgment, abilities, and perceptions. Through subtle questioning, contradictions, and suggestions of inadequacy. The technique erodes self-trust to create dependence on external validation. The process begins with small challenges to the victim's certainty about minor matters. Their memory of conversations, their interpretation of events, or their judgment about people gets questioned in ways that seem helpful rather than attacking. Incremental escalation gradually expands the areas where their judgment is challenged. What began as occasional corrections becomes systematic undermining of their confidence in increasingly important areas of their life and decision-making. Alternative explanations are consistently offered for the victim's experiences and interpretations. When they feel hurt, they're told they're oversensitive. When they notice problems, they're told they're overthinking. Their emotional and cognitive responses are reframed as unreliable. Competence questioning extends the doubt to their abilities and achievements. Past successes are attributed to luck or help from others rather than skill. Current difficulties are highlighted while strengths are minimized or ignored. The validation dependency develops as internal confidence erodes. The victim begins seeking external confirmation for decisions they would previously make independently. The doubter becomes increasingly important as a source of judgment and guidance. Professional environments often feature confidence, undermining through consistent criticism, questioning of professional judgment, or attribution of successes to team effort, while failures are attributed to individual inadequacy. The Baader-Meinhof Phenomenon. The Baader-Meinhof Phenomenon, also known as frequency illusion, occurs when something you've recently learned about or focused on suddenly appears everywhere. Manipulators exploit this cognitive bias by introducing specific concepts, threats, or opportunities that then seem to appear frequently in unrelated contexts. The initial exposure plants a concept in conscious awareness that was previously filtered out by attention mechanisms. Once awareness is activated, the concept becomes more noticeable in environments where it was always present but ignored. Confirmation bias amplifies the effect by making people more likely to notice and remember instances that confirm the recently introduced concept while continuing to ignore contradictory evidence. The selective attention creates an illusion of increased frequency. Pattern recognition systems in the brain begin connecting previously unrelated events to the new concept, creating apparent correlations that seem meaningful but may be entirely coincidental. Random events start appearing connected through the lens of the introduced idea. Urgency creation uses the apparent frequency increase to suggest that action is needed immediately. If problems, opportunities, or threats seem to be appearing everywhere, delayed response might mean missing critical chances or experiencing avoidable harm. Marketing and propaganda frequently exploit this phenomenon by introducing product categories, social issues, or political concepts that then seem to appear constantly in media and conversation. The artificial frequency creates impression of importance and relevance. Understanding that increased noticing doesn't necessarily indicate increased occurrence. When something seems to be appearing everywhere after recent exposure to it, consider whether the frequency has actually changed or whether your attention has been directed towards something that was already present. The IKEA Effect. The IKEA Effect describes the tendency to value things more highly when we've contributed effort to creating them, regardless of the actual quality or objective value of the result. Manipulators exploit this bias by getting people to invest effort in outcomes that serve the manipulator's interests. The investment process involves getting targets to contribute time, energy, ideas, or resources toward achieving specific goals. The investment creates psychological ownership that makes people more committed to defending and pursuing those goals. Effort justification occurs when people convince themselves that outcomes must be valuable because they've invested significant effort in achieving them. Admitting the goals aren't worthwhile would mean acknowledging that their effort was wasted. Customization illusion makes people feel that outcomes specifically reflect their input and preferences, even when their actual influence was minimal. Small choices or contributions create feelings of ownership over entire projects or results. Sunk cost protection prevents people from abandoning projects once they've invested effort, even when continuing would be irrational. The prior investment becomes justification for continued investment, regardless of changing circumstances or evidence. Political and organizational manipulation frequently uses this technique by involving people in planning, decision-making processes, or implementation activities that create investment in predetermined outcomes. The participation creates ownership feelings that reduce resistance. The Zeigarnik Effect. The Zeigarnik Effect describes the tendency to remember interrupted or incomplete tasks more vividly than completed ones. Manipulators exploit this psychological tendency by creating artificial incompletions that maintain mental preoccupation with their agenda. The interruption timing must occur after sufficient investment to create engagement, but before resolution provides closure. The mental tension of incompletion maintains attention and motivation to return to the unfinished business. Artificial obstacles create interruptions in naturally progressing activities. Just as momentum builds toward completion, new requirements, delays, or complications emerge that prevent closure while maintaining investment in the eventual outcome. Mental preoccupation continues even when people are engaged in other activities. The incomplete tasks consume cognitive resources and emotional energy, making it difficult to focus fully on alternative priorities or competing interests. Completion promises maintain hope that resolution is possible while keeping the timeline indefinite. The manipulator suggests that obstacles are temporary and completion is imminent, preventing people from abandoning their investment. Serial techniques involve creating multiple incomplete loops that maintain several different sources of mental preoccupation simultaneously. Each unfinished element reinforces the others, while preventing mental closure and redirection of attention. Media and marketing exploitation includes cliffhanger narratives, partial information reveals, limited time offers, and multi-part presentations that maintain engagement through artificial incompletion rather than genuine value. Recognition requires awareness of mental energy being consumed by unresolved situations and conscious evaluation of whether the potential completion justifies the ongoing psychological investment and opportunity costs. Public shaming. Public shaming exploits the fundamental human fear of social exclusion by threatening or implementing public exposure of embarrassing information, failures, or violations of social norms. The technique leverages community pressure to enforce compliance without requiring direct confrontation. The exposure threat often proves more powerful than actual exposure because imagination fills gaps with worst-case scenarios. The victim's anxiety about potential social consequences creates compliance pressure even when the threatened exposure might not occur. Audience manipulation involves carefully selecting or cultivating witnesses who will react with appropriate disapproval or judgment. The shamer either chooses naturally unsympathetic audiences or presents information in ways that generate negative reactions. Social proof amplification occurs when public criticism generates additional criticism from observers who join the condemnation to demonstrate their own social acceptability. The original shame multiplies through social contagion effects. Identity destruction goes beyond specific behaviors to attack the person's overall character, competence, or social standing. The shaming doesn't just highlight mistakes, but suggests fundamental personal inadequacy that justifies broader social rejection. Digital amplification through social media creates permanent records of shaming events that can be repeatedly referenced and shared. Online shaming can reach massive audiences and create lasting reputational damage far beyond what traditional social circles could achieve. Cancel culture represents systematic public shaming designed to destroy careers, relationships, and social standing through coordinated exposure and denunciation campaigns that extend far beyond the original controversy. Recognition requires understanding that public criticism might serve manipulative purposes rather than legitimate accountability, especially when the response seems disproportionate to the actual offense or when it targets character rather than specific behaviors. Hoovering. Hoovering describes the manipulative technique of drawing previously discarded victims back into toxic relationships through renewed attention, promises of change, or manufactured crises that require their involvement. The name comes from the vacuum cleaner brand, referencing the sucking back in process. The timing typically occurs when the victim has begun establishing independence, forming new relationships, or showing signs of moving forward with their life. The manipulator senses the loss of control and initiates renewed contact to restore the previous dynamic. Artificial emergencies create immediate pressure for contact and involvement. Health crises, family problems, financial difficulties, or professional emergencies that supposedly require the victim's unique help or support become reasons to re-establish communication. Promise-making involves claims of personal growth, therapy completion, spiritual transformation, or life changes that address the previous problems in the relationship. These promises sound specific and sincere, but typically lack concrete evidence or verification. Nostalgia manipulation focuses attention on positive memories from the relationship, while minimizing or reframing the negative experiences that led to separation. The manipulator highlights the good times while explaining away or justifying the harmful behaviors. Guilt induction suggests that abandoning the manipulator during their time of need demonstrates cruelty or selfishness. The victim's natural compassion and sense of responsibility get weaponized to override their self-protective instincts. Intermittent reinforcement makes the renewed attention particularly powerful because it contrasts sharply with recent absence. The attention feels more valuable because it was withdrawn, creating artificial scarcity that increases its perceived worth. Understanding that renewed contact from harmful people likely serves their interests rather than representing genuine change or emergency need. Past patterns of behavior predict future behavior more accurately than current promises or claims. Memory manipulation. Memory manipulation exploits the malleable nature of human recall to systematically alter victims' understanding of past events. Unlike simple lying about what happened, this technique actually changes how events are remembered by introducing false details, emphasizing certain aspects while suppressing others, and creating entirely fabricated memories. The process operates through repeated exposure to alternative versions of events that gradually replace original memories. Each time a memory is recalled, it becomes vulnerable to modification. Skilled manipulators introduce subtle changes during these recall moments that become integrated into the stored memory. Suggestive questioning plants false details through leading questions that assume facts, not in evidence. When you threw that object at me, what were you thinking? Presupposes that throwing occurred even if it didn't. The question format makes denial feel argumentative rather than factual correction. Collaborative reconstruction involves multiple people confirming false versions of events, making the victim doubt their own recollection in favor of apparent group consensus. When several sources agree on details that differ from your memory, the social pressure to accept their version becomes overwhelming. Photographic and document manipulation creates false evidence that supports the altered narrative. Edited images, fabricated records, or doctored communications provide apparent proof of events that never occurred or occurred differently than remembered. Emotional overlay during recall sessions associates false memories with genuine emotions from actual experiences. The authentic emotional component makes fabricated memories feel real and personal, increasing their believability and integration into identity. Sleep deprivation and stress increase memory vulnerability by impairing consolidation processes and making recall less reliable. When people are uncertain about their own memories due to compromised cognitive function, they become more accepting of external versions of events. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance, manipulation, deliberately creates psychological tension by forcing people to hold contradictory beliefs, values, or commitments simultaneously. The resulting mental discomfort drives behavioral changes as people attempt to resolve the uncomfortable inconsistency. The technique begins by securing commitment to beliefs or values that will later conflict with desired behaviors. Once people have publicly or privately committed to certain principles, introducing situations that require violation of those principles creates internal tension that demands resolution. Foot in the door escalation uses small initial commitments that seem consistent with personal values to establish precedent for larger commitments that gradually deviate from those same values. Each step feels logical individually, while the overall progression leads far from the starting point. Justification pressure occurs when people must choose between admitting their behavior contradicts their values or changing their values to match their behavior. Most people find it easier to modify beliefs than to acknowledge personal inconsistency. Social identity conflicts create dissonance by positioning group membership or loyalty against individual judgment. When belonging requires accepting beliefs that contradict personal experience or logic, the need for social connection often wins over intellectual honesty. Sunk cost dissonance emerges when continuing current behavior contradicts good judgment, but abandoning it means admitting that previous investments were mistakes. The psychological cost of acknowledging error often exceeds the practical cost of continuing poor decisions. Authority-induced dissonance occurs when trusted leaders or institutions promote beliefs or behaviors that conflict with personal values. The choice between maintaining trust and maintaining consistency creates vulnerability to manipulation by authority figures. Pacing and leading. Pacing and leading represents a sophisticated influence technique where manipulators first match the victim's current state, beliefs, or behaviors to establish rapport, then gradually guide them toward different states or actions. The process leverages natural human tendency to follow those who seem to understand and mirror us. The pacing phase requires accurate observation and matching of the target's communication patterns, emotional state, values, and behavioral rhythms. The manipulator becomes a psychological mirror that reflects back the victim's own characteristics, creating feelings of connection and understanding. Rapport establishment through pacing makes the victim feel heard, understood, and validated. When someone accurately reflects your thoughts, feelings, or experiences, it creates the impression that they truly comprehend your perspective in ways others don't. The transition to leading must be subtle enough to maintain the established rapport while gradually introducing new elements. The manipulator begins adding slight variations to their mirroring that guide the victim in desired directions. Behavioral leading starts with small changes in posture, speech patterns, or energy levels that the victim unconsciously follows. As the victim adapts to match these changes, the manipulator gains increasing influence over their physical and emotional state. Conceptual leading introduces new ideas or perspectives that build logically on the victim's expressed beliefs, while subtly shifting toward the manipulator's goals. The progression feels natural because each step connects to previously established common ground. Emotional leading guides feelings by gradually shifting the emotional tone of interactions. A skilled manipulator can move someone from suspicion to trust, from clarity to confusion, or from independence to dependence, through careful emotional pacing and leading. Professional applications include sales processes, therapy sessions, and political persuasion, where practitioners use pacing and leading to guide audiences toward predetermined outcomes while maintaining the illusion of natural development. Suggestive language and hypnosis. Suggestive language and hypnotic techniques operate by bypassing critical thinking to implant ideas directly into the unconscious mind. These methods exploit altered states of consciousness where normal psychological defenses are relaxed or suspended. The induction process creates a focused attention state where external distractions fade and internal awareness becomes heightened. This can occur through formal hypnotic procedures or through conversation techniques that create similar mental states without obvious ritual. Language patterns use specific grammatical structures that communicate to unconscious processing systems while avoiding conscious analysis. Embedded commands, presuppositions, and linguistic binds convey messages that feel like natural conversation while carrying hypnotic influence. Relaxation and comfort creation makes people more receptive to suggestion by reducing tension and critical analysis. When people feel safe and comfortable, their psychological guard drops, allowing greater access to unconscious programming. Confusion techniques overwhelm conscious processing through information overload, rapid topic changes, or contradictory statements that force the mind to rely on unconscious pattern matching rather than logical analysis. Repetition and reinforcement embed suggestions more deeply through multiple exposures using different words and contexts. The same underlying message appears in various forms until it becomes integrated into unconscious belief systems. Authority positioning enhances suggestive power through credentials, confidence, or social proof that makes the suggestions seem more credible and worthy of acceptance. Expert status bypasses critical evaluation of the actual content. Posthypnotic suggestion creates behavioral triggers that activate desired responses automatically when specific conditions are met. These can influence future decision-making without conscious awareness of the original programming. Bandwagon Effect. The bandwagon effect exploits the human tendency to adopt beliefs and behaviors simply because many other people have adopted them. This psychological bias assumes that popular choices must be correct choices, making group consensus a powerful tool for manipulation. The perception management involves creating impressions of widespread adoption through artificial social proof. This might include fabricated testimonials, inflated participation numbers, or strategic presentation of selective evidence that suggests universal acceptance. Artificial urgency combines with bandwagon effects through claims that opportunities are disappearing as more people discover them. The fear of missing out on what others are gaining creates pressure for immediate adoption without careful evaluation. Social proof multiplication occurs when early adopters are used to recruit additional participants who then become proof for subsequent targets. Each new participant legitimizes the choice for others, creating exponential growth in perceived popularity. FOMO amplification leverages fear of missing out on social experiences, opportunities, or benefits that others are supposedly receiving. The emphasis shifts from evaluating merit to avoiding social isolation or competitive disadvantage. Authority endorsement enhances bandwagon effects when respected figures or institutions appear to support popular choices. The combination of expert approval and popular adoption seems to provide both logical and social validation. Echo chamber creation reinforces bandwagon effects by ensuring that participants primarily encounter others who have made similar choices. This manufactured consensus prevents exposure to alternative perspectives that might challenge the popular choice. Digital manipulation through fake followers, artificial engagement, and algorithmic amplification creates false impressions of organic popularity that drive real adoption through perceived social proof. Recognition requires questioning why something's popularity should determine its value for your specific situation, and seeking information about alternatives that might not have marketing resources to create artificial bandwagon effects. The constraints. Constraint manipulation involves systematically limiting someone's options, resources, or decision-making capacity to make them more compliant and easier to control. By reducing available choices, manipulators guide victims toward predetermined outcomes while maintaining the illusion of voluntary decision-making. Time constraints create artificial urgency that prevents careful evaluation of options or consequences. Limited time offers, deadline pressure, or scheduled scarcity force rapid decisions that favor the manipulator's interests over the victim's careful consideration. Information constraints control what data is available for decision-making. By limiting access to relevant facts, alternative perspectives, or comparative options, manipulators ensure that available information supports their preferred outcomes. Financial constraints involve creating or emphasizing resource limitations that make certain options appear impossible or impractical. Economic pressure becomes a tool for guiding choices toward alternatives that serve the manipulator's interests. Social constraints use relationship pressure, group expectations, or reputation concerns to limit behavioral options. When certain choices would result in social consequences, people avoid those options regardless of their objective merit. Physical constraints involve environmental limitations that restrict movement, access, or communication options. Controlled settings limit the victim's ability to seek alternatives or escape unwanted situations. Emotional constraints create psychological barriers through fear, guilt, shame, or obligation that make certain choices feel impossible, even when they're technically available. The internal barriers become more effective than external restrictions. Legal or procedural constraints establish complex requirements, lengthy processes, or bureaucratic obstacles that make legitimate options difficult or impossible to pursue while maintaining easier alternatives that benefit the manipulator. The power of touch. Physical touch carries powerful psychological influence that operates below conscious awareness, while significantly affecting trust, compliance, and emotional connection. Manipulators exploit this biological response system to gain advantage in interactions and relationships. The neurological impact occurs through oxytocin release and activation of attachment systems that evolve to promote bonding and cooperation. Physical contact triggers automatic trust responses that bypass rational evaluation of the person's actual trustworthiness. Strategic timing uses touch during emotionally significant moments to associate positive physical sensations with specific people, ideas, or decisions. The emotional memory becomes linked with the physical experience, creating positive associations. Dominance assertion through touch establishes power dynamics without verbal acknowledgement. Strategic placement of hands, controlling physical space, or initiating contact demonstrates control while maintaining social acceptability. Comfort manipulation involves offering physical comfort during distress to create dependency and positive association. The person providing comfort becomes associated with relief and safety, even when they may have caused the original distress. Boundary testing uses increasingly intimate or inappropriate touch to assess resistance levels and establish precedent for future violations. Each unchallenged contact normalizes greater intimacy and reduces future resistance. Professional exploitation occurs when authority figures use their position to justify unnecessary physical contact that serves their interests rather than legitimate professional purposes. The power differential prevents effective resistance. Cultural exploitation takes advantage of social norms around politeness, respect, or cultural practices that make refusing physical contact seem rude or inappropriate, even when the contact makes people uncomfortable. The power of playing dumb. Strategic ignorance involves deliberately appearing less knowledgeable, capable, or aware than you actually are, to manipulate others into revealing information, lowering their guard, or taking actions they wouldn't normally take. This technique exploits people's tendency to help those who seem helpless and to underestimate those who appear incompetent. Information gathering benefits from appearing ignorant about topics where others have expertise or sensitive knowledge. People readily share information with those who seem too naive or uninformed to use it against them. Threat reduction occurs when potential rivals or opponents underestimate your capabilities and therefore don't take defensive measures against your actual abilities. Looking harmless prevents others from recognizing you as competition. Responsibility avoidance uses apparent incompetence to escape obligations, accountability, or expectations for performance. If you seem incapable of handling complex tasks, others will either do them themselves or assign them elsewhere. Confession elicitation works because people often reveal information to those who seem unlikely to understand its significance or use it effectively. Playing dumb encourages others to explain their actions, motivations, or plans in detail. Underestimation advantages occur in negotiations, competitions, or conflicts where opponents prepare for lesser challenges than you actually present. Their inadequate preparation gives you strategic advantage they wouldn't have allowed if they'd recognized your true capabilities. Sympathy generation makes others more willing to help, forgive mistakes, or provide favorable treatment to someone who appears to be struggling with basic competence. The appearance of vulnerability triggers protective instincts. Investigation protection allows you to ask probing questions or explore sensitive topics under the guise of innocent curiosity rather than deliberate investigation. People answer questions from the apparently naive that they would refuse from the obviously intelligent. The contrast principle. The contrast principle exploits the human tendency to evaluate things relative to other available options rather than on absolute merit. By controlling what options are compared, manipulators influence how choices appear and which alternatives seem most attractive. Sequential presentation uses timing to enhance contrast effects. Showing inferior options before superior ones makes the better choice seem even more attractive. Conversely, showing excellent options before good ones makes the good ones seem inadequate. Decoy effects involve presenting options that are obviously inferior to make target choices appear superior by comparison. The decoy serves no purpose except to make other options look better through contrast. Anchoring integration combines contrast with reference point manipulation. Extreme starting prices make moderate prices seem reasonable, while luxury options make premium choices feel like compromise positions. Context manipulation changes the comparison environment to favor desired outcomes. The same option appears different when compared to budget alternatives versus premium choices, even when the option itself remains unchanged. Artificial categories create comparison frameworks that emphasize certain features while de-emphasizing others. By controlling what aspects get compared, manipulators guide attention toward features that favor their preferred choices. Emotional contrast pairs logical comparisons with emotional associations that influence evaluation beyond rational factors. Options are compared not just on features but on feelings, status implications, and identity associations. Professional pricing strategies use contrast through product line positioning, promotional frameworks, and competitive comparisons that make target products appear optimally positioned within artificially created choice sets. Recognition requires evaluating options on their absolute merit rather than relative positioning, seeking additional alternatives beyond those being presented, and understanding that contrast effects might be artificially manufactured to influence your choices. Exploiting need for closure. The need for closure represents a powerful psychological drive to resolve uncertainty, complete unfinished business, and achieve definitive conclusions. Manipulators exploit this drive by creating artificial uncertainty that only they can resolve, making people dependent on them for psychological completion. Uncertainty creation involves introducing ambiguity, incomplete information, or conflicting data that prevents people from reaching satisfying conclusions on their own. The manipulator positions themselves as the source of clarity and resolution. Information withholding maintains uncertainty by revealing partial facts that suggest important patterns while withholding key details needed for complete understanding. The partial revelation creates urgency for complete information. Cliffhanger psychology uses interrupted narratives, delayed gratification, or suspended outcomes to maintain engagement through unresolved tension. The desire for completion keeps people invested in processes they might otherwise abandon. False dilemmas present limited options as complete choice sets, while hiding additional alternatives that might provide better closure. The artificial limitation forces decisions within frameworks that serve the manipulator's interests. Artificial deadlines create time pressure that forces incomplete closure rather than thorough evaluation. The fear of missing opportunities drives premature decision-making that provides inadequate resolution. Expertise positioning makes the manipulator appear uniquely qualified to provide the closure that others cannot offer. They become indispensable for resolving uncertainties they may have created. Serial revelation provides closure in small increments that maintain engagement while gradually building toward larger commitments. Each small resolution increases investment in achieving complete closure. The Endowment Effect. The Endowment Effect exploits the psychological tendency to value things more highly, simply because we own them or feel ownership toward them. Manipulators create artificial ownership feelings to increase the perceived value of things they want people to keep, buy, or defend. Possession creation involves giving people temporary control, use, or access to items, ideas, or opportunities to create psychological ownership before asking for commitment. Free trials, borrowed items, or provisional access create attachment that increases perceived value. Loss aversion, amplification, occurs when people must choose between giving up something they feel they own versus acquiring something new. The pain of losing familiar possessions exceeds the pleasure of gaining equivalent alternatives. Customization illusion makes people feel ownership over items they've personalized or modified, even when the underlying item belongs to someone else. Small personal touches create disproportionate attachment to objects or arrangements. Investment. Psychology transforms effort or resources spent on something into ownership feelings that increase its perceived value. Time invested in learning about products or exploring options creates commitment that influences final decisions. Identity integration connects possessions with self-concept, so that losing them feels like losing part of personal identity. When items become symbols of status, achievement, or personality, their perceived value exceeds their functional worth. Scarcity enhancement combines with endowment effects by suggesting that owned items are rare or difficult to replace. The combination of ownership feelings and scarcity perception dramatically inflates perceived value. Professional applications include real estate, showing strategies where buyers spend significant time in properties, car dealerships that encourage extended test drives, and subscription services that create user customization before billing begins.